Hello and welcome to episode 3 of our journey through William Shakespeare's Macbeth. The play began with thunder, lightning and witches, and today as we head into Act 1 Scene 2 we will see a raging battle and also meet the fictional King of Scotland for the first time. However, we see immediately that Duncan is a weak king. There is a battle going on. His country and therefore all of his subjects are under threat, but he is not fighting. He's waiting in his camp, waiting to hear an update from one of his captains. And this is said to be one of the many ways that Shakespeare uses the plot of Macbeth to praise King James. James was the exact opposite of this weak king. He was a ruler so strong that he was able to unite England and Scotland under his rule. And we've already touched on one of the reasons that Shakespeare could have been praising James. James was a known sponsor of his theatre company, the King's Men. But there could also be a case made that Shakespeare was trying to prove his loyalty to the king, following the revelation that his father was linked to a number of the conspirators behind the Gunpowder Plot, most notably Robert Catesby, who was said to be his father's best friend. A quick reminder on annotation. I will be annotating general plot points in green, contextual factors in blue, and writer's craft in red. We start this scene with an introduction to one of the play's most vital motifs. A motif is a dominant or constant theme in a piece of art or literature, and the motif in question here is blood. The idea or appearance of blood has a number of purposes in the play. Firstly, it represents guilt, and we will see a lot more of that later. But for now, it really emphasises the violence that is present in the play. This captain has been in a battle so violent and bloody that he is badly wounded. It is also ironic that Duncan is the person who introduces the motif of blood, as it is his blood that will lead the plot forward. Then we hear from the captain, or sergeant as he is called here. Immediately he discusses how closely fought the battle has been. And this could also be a reference to the entanglement of Macbeth and MacDonald, the Thane of Cawdor, in terms of both their action in the battle and the violence that they display. This is our first time hearing of a link between the two, but there are more to come in this scene. The captain then calls this conflict a damned quarrel, suggesting that the campaign of the Norwegians and Scottish rebels goes against the king, and therefore against God. The link between God and his chosen ruler on earth was explicitly believed in Jacobean society. That was the natural order. It was the great chain of being. And Shakespeare's audience would have been well aware of the consequences for anyone who attempted to meddle with this natural order. The rest of this speech is given to building up the character of Macbeth, both in terms of the play and in terms of the audience's perception of him. The audience and the king hear together about Macbeth's courage and bravery in battle, including a description of him as Valor's minion. He is the embodiment of courage, and his body is the servant of this courage. Potentially more interestingly, though, is the presentation of Macbeth's violence. We hear of a gruesome and barbaric way that he has unseamed an enemy, and there is a question regarding whether this violence is too excessive. Does it potentially hint at the dark side that his character holds? Macbeth then beheads him and fixes his head atop the army's battlements, and this death foreshadows the final death in the play, which also sees a traitor beheaded. And we end this section with Duncan calling Macbeth worthy, yet another link between he and MacDonald, who was previously described in the same words. We move on to another introduction, this time the worthy Thane of Ross. A lot of introductions in this scene, and Ross is a minor character in terms of the overall plot, but he is functional. He is a messenger and he delivers important news to characters, moving the plot of the play forward in the process. Ross's first words here reinforce the great chain of being and the link between God and his chosen ruler, the king. He then has more information on the battle and more on the traitorous Thane of Cawdor. He says that Norwegian banners are raised in Fife. The people and the country are struggling. and he's just really reinforcing the viable threat of the enemy and the horror that they bring. By doing this, it builds up Macbeth's heroism and makes him look even better to the audience. Ross talks about the most disloyal traitor, the Thane of Cawdor, who betrayed the king and started this conflict, leading to the violence and bloodshed that we have been hearing about. Some more really subtle foreshadowing there by Shakespeare, in terms of Cawdor betraying the king and how that leads to violence and bloodshed at the hands of Macbeth. Bellona was the Roman goddess of war, and by being her bridegroom, Macbeth becomes above her in terms of her skill, power, violence, and lust for war. And we then come back to the original image, Macbeth and MacDonald entangled together. MacDonald was the vicious, violent traitor, but he is not vicious and he is not violent enough. He is defeated by Macbeth. More foreshadowing there. Due to this, the Norwegians now want peace. Macbeth has led the armies to victory. He is the hero. Then some more foreshadowing, this time through Duncan, making the Scottish king seem naive as well as weak. There will be no more deceit from the traitorous Thane of Cawdor as he is sentenced to death. This is also ironic, as the next thing that the Thane of Cawdor, Macbeth by this point, does is deceive the king and his subjects. We then get a rhyming couplet, used here to draw attention to a vital plot point. MacDonald is out. He is no longer Thane of Cawdor. That title will pass to brave, heroic Macbeth. Macbeth will succeed MacDonald, firstly in title, but latterly in action. Ross responds with a very short line, but something that is linked to a much bigger and wider reaching idea throughout the play. He will see Duncan's wishes done. And it is this word, or at least the sound, that is important, as it is repeated over 30 times through the course of the play. It emphasises the idea of fated acts, the idea that everything is destined to happen, that it will be done, no matter what. And once the act of naming Macbeth as the Thane of Cawdor is done, it brings a chain reaction and sets everything else in motion. We finish here with Duncan almost repeating a line from the Witches in Act 1, Scene 1, battle lost and won. A direct link to them and their power in terms of the plot. Are their powers permeating and influencing even at the highest level of king? Even if they're not here, they soon will be. This is a direct foreshadowing of the conflict between good and evil, of the natural order versus the supernatural, and of God's chosen ruler against evil supernatural spirits. And it's not a coincidence that this foreshadowing leads directly into Duncan praising Macbeth again. It is the events and the influence of the themes that I have just listed that leads to what happens at the end of Act 1. But for now, Macbeth is the loyal and noble servant to King Duncan. At the end of Act 1, Scene 2, we have seen the end of the battle that was discussed by the witches. We have met the King of Scotland and been introduced to the brave and loyal, yet brutal and violent Macbeth. As well as this, we have seen the traitorous Thane of Cawdor defeated in battle, and we now know that Macbeth will soon be granted his title. The audience would have remembered that the witches had planned to meet with Macbeth after the battle had ended, so they would now be waiting for this meeting to take place. Even though we have seen that he has fought and won the battle for Scotland, I think there is more than a brief suggestion that Macbeth could be seduced by evil. He seems to be overly violent and almost revels in the death that he can bring. Him potentially meeting with the forces of evil gives the play a dark, foreboding atmosphere. If you have any extra notes that you think would be useful at this point, please add them to your scripts now, and also feel free to add them in the comment section below. And please don't forget to like, share and subscribe to the channel. You can also find and follow us over on Instagram at OpenBookPC. I'll see you next time on the Heath to finally meet with Macbeth in Act 1, Scene 3.